what we have is exactly the opposite of that, because our most trained individuals are making newbie gains when they get into studies.
Okay. Huh.
This is what we're seeing. In fact, this standard deviation bar did not dip below zero. This is the most impressive of all those values, I would say, of the standard deviation bars. I covered them up are larger. But our most trained individuals are making gains in fat-free mass equivalent to those of the completely untrained individuals.
And that's not what you normally hear. You normally hear, well, these studies were done on untrained individuals, so of course they gained.
Right. This is why this meta-analysis is so interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm not making this data up. This isn't like one particular study. This is what's seen when you look at the collective whole of the studies that met the inclusion criteria for their meta-analysis, that they were not finding any association with any of their outcome measures for muscle mass between training experience and the gains in any of those outcome measures.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to Muscle Minds with Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McNally, and all of our programming is brought to you by Scott's book, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. You can go to byobbcoach.com to download the ebook, or we've got a link below that you can get the hardcover. In fact, there's a few places you can get the hardcover, but right now Scott has a few copies left over on eBay. I'm going to have a link to that below, and if you buy it from him, he's going to send it to you himself. He's going to sign it for you and inscribe it to you. So definitely take advantage of that while he's got a few copies left. We are brought to you by TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK over there for now 10% off all orders, and you can still get like free shipping over $99. Literally, they have some of the best high quality supplements on the market. That's the reason that I've stood behind them for, I can almost say decades now, because it's been that long. It's been over 15 years. We're also brought to you by supplementsource.ca for Canadians. They have great deals that do change week to week on short-dated, label change products, things like that. So definitely check them out, as well as all your basic, normal, over-the-counter supplements, regular price stuff too. Definitely, they're awesome in Canada. And last but not least, thank you guys from Patreon. We'll probably get back around to tackling some Patreon questions here in the future. But for today, Scott, you've got another PowerPoint lined up for us, another presentation. I've got my coffee ready. I'm excited for this one. This is going to be about the law of diminishing returns. I don't really know anything about it, right?
Yeah. Let's just launch into it. It's all self-enclosed, self-explanatory.
I love it.
Yeah. So let's see here. Let's share my screen.
I feel like I'm in class every time.
Yeah. Okay.
Really
Pipe down, students. Pipe down. We're getting ready to start here. So I'm gonna go now. I'll be looking up here. I've got my double screen scenario going here. So basically, you'll see once I get into this, there's this basic notion about muscle growth. So the longer you're at it, the less the gains are. They come harder. There's a law of diminishing returns. And you would expect then to see this in the scientific evidence. We know we see this in the trenches in reality, right? And there's one study, several slides in, a meta-analysis actually, that really was phenomenally interesting. And I want to share some insights from that. So, first, some things about approaching your genetic or your possibly enhanced limit in the law of diminishing returns. So this suggests that muscle growth is faster initially. There's newbie gains. It depends on a learning curve. If you've got poor training, poor nutrition, various things can impair your gains. But you definitely would get gains faster initially. You might not be able to see them if you were to do a muscle biopsy 1 week into it, but you turn on protein synthesis from that first workout. And that these gains would slow down over time, and then you would approach some limit in a sort of asymptotic fashion, right? Where the muscle growth is very slow and maybe even inconsequential. Your genetics play a role. Sorry for the typos. A big thing I think that is I'm seeing sort of less and less, because people are influenced, I think, by social media. They want to stay in shape. They don't want to put their health at risk, what have you. Although there's some contradictions perhaps there. But the thing that also makes a difference is how willing someone is to drive their body weight up. So what their personal boundaries are, like they don't want to have to be. I mean, back when I was competing, I had literally like 3 different sets of clothes almost. I had shirts I knew I could only wear when I got to like 2.25 or below.
Yeah.
They would not fit at 230, 240, 250, or 260. I had some shirts that looked silly when I was getting ready to step on stage, but they looked great in an off season.
Yeah.
Obviously, pharmacological interventions, and then the most important thing is whether you watch the Think Big Network, a podcast. So that's
I love
really
that.
what
Yes.
that's the absolutely. So let's see. I want to get to something here before we get to those other points. This is basically a figure that I reproduced from the American College of Sports Medicine position stand. Bill Kramer was the first author on here. They didn't. They said this is based on research, but they really didn't cite their sources in a way that I could follow up. But this is the basic idea that we have in untrained individuals, and this is strength gains here. Different. It's a different scenario. So this is not muscle mass, which the focus is, but it just kind of shows this idea. You would go from untrained to moderately trained, and then your gains wouldn't be nearly as great over time as when you were untrained, and then you would become trained, advanced, and then elite. And I know the elite, this comes from long-term studies of Olympic lifters, for instance, out of Scandinavia, where they make very, very small gains, but at that level it makes a difference. They can add a few kilos to their clean and jerk and their snatch each. That might be the difference between 4th place and 1st place. So back to this law of diminishing returns, it's patently obvious on an individual basis empirically. Everyone sees this essentially. Gains don't, unless you do something after 2 years of training, some of the things I mentioned above, for instance, pharmacological intervention, or you actually start paying attention to your training, your nutrition in a way that you hadn't, or maybe you found some magical technique like progressive overload, the gains are going to come more slowly. We know this, and this is what we also would expect cross-sectionally as well. All other factors being equal, subject training experience should mean a lesser rate of muscle mass accrual, right? And people can ask, this is what you see in the gym where you train. Yes, there's probably the people who are the regulars are there. They look the same year in and year out. They're not all of a sudden making big gains, and if they are, then it's quote unquote suspect.
Yeah.
So the question that we're going to get into is this apparent in studies where advanced trainees are intentionally recruited, and sometimes that's a very good thing. It's for external validity purposes, meaning would this study apply to people who are not beginners? So they pick out recreationally trained or advanced or what have you, just using that term very generically. Unfortunately, it's not often described with great detail, so you knew who you have. A lot of times they do have strength measurements, and when you look at what their bench press is, we're like, those people aren't really super advanced. But we also have to remember that most of the time steroid use, almost all the time, unless that's something that's being examined, steroid use is an exclusion criterion. So you're not going to have people who are benching 315 for sets of 12 coming into your studies. Hold on just a sec. Let me move this thing out of the way. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that what works in beginners, what creates a training effect, muscle growth effect, might not work if you're more advanced. So the one that we were just talking about before the podcast is that if you're training in the lengthened position, and there's an interesting meta-analysis that just came out showing not a big difference between training length position and shortened position. Interestingly enough, it's Brad Schoenfeld, one of the authors, Milo Wolf. I can forget the name of the first author right now. But if you are training in the lengthened position and you add that in as advanced individuals, and you've already exploited stretch-mediated sarcomerogenesis, which is one of the potential ways in which this could create more muscle growth, by lengthening the fascicles, making the fascicles longer, and then thus increasing the overall mass of the muscle with the cross-sectional area thickness when you measure it in that way.
Which we talked about on a previous show.
Right. So if you've already done that because you've been training full range of motion, you may have gotten all you're going to get out of that way in which you could enhance muscle growth because you've already exploited that avenue. There's nothing left there to be had. Let me go down past this. My animations they get a little fancier here.
Yeah, I see that.
So, yeah, sorry about that. So here's a pair of studies. Ogasawara, 2012, 2013. They did the first study was just normal training. This 2013 study, I'll show you plots from both of them. Really interesting study. They had one group train intermittently. They trained for 6 weeks on, and then took 3 weeks off, and then they went back on, and they compared that to a group who just trained continuously. So they trained in 6 months in total. Of course, the intermittent group didn't train for 6 months continuously, but it was a 6-month period of training with the 6 on 3 off pattern. And they measured thickness in the pec and the triceps brachii. And there was a law of diminishing returns. So this is the first study, and here we see the number of weeks of training and what happened to muscle thickness in terms of millimeters, and it goes up pretty well here, and we see this sort of law of diminishing returns apply. Okay. Again, this is 6 months. This is what you'd expect, right? It seems to be going up a little faster here in the pec major, and you don't see it quite as abruptly, but I would say that there seems to be a law of diminishing. It may not be statistically evident. I'm sure if they did a curve fitting analysis, they might see that some sort of exponential curve would be a best fit, so, as opposed to a linear curve. If I just sort of hand draw this would be linear. Oops. This would be more of a linear gain. So there's something that's tapering off here.
Yeah.
Here's this intermittent study. This was really cool, well done study. They've got 2 groups. So this is the open circles of the groups. Again, same duration, same phenomenon. Here's the triceps brachii, law of diminishing returns. We see the same thing here with the pec. So in this case, it's percent change as opposed to the actual muscle thickness. And then one group trained for 6 weeks, took 3 off. They lost a little bit, and they trained again, and they lost a little bit, and then they kind of retrained again. And you see the same pattern with the pec. So we see in general in the control group in the second study or the first study, we got this law of diminishing returns. Interestingly enough, we're seeing here after this off period that when they're starting anew, they make faster gains. Mm-hmm. Because what ends up happening is they make up for the lost ground and end up at the same place at the end.
Okay.
So they're actually, during these 6 weeks of training, they're making faster gains because they eventually end up at the same place despite training for, in this case, a month and a half less over this 6-month training period.
Huh.
So things are faster initially and slower thereafter. So the rate of gains here in this section here with the continuous training were less than during these 2 periods of quote-unquote retraining where they're just starting off because they end up in the same spot.
Yeah. So
again, law of diminishing returns. I took the liberty here to reanalyze one of my favorite studies, is Sterin et al. From 1991. Trained women here. I don't think I put that in there with the other women resistance training twice a week, 20 weeks of training, and they actually had 2 groups. This was actually a retraining study. That's what it's best known for. But I'm just looking at the training scenarios here. So what we see on the left here are the cross-sectional areas of the respective fiber types, and this is an older study. So we've got type 1, type 2, and what they call type 2AB and 2B. We would call those type 2X and type 2AX and type 2X.
Okay. This
isn't used anymore. So this shows you how old this is. There's interesting but long story as to why that terminology was changed. So in the main study, they trained one group of women for 20 weeks, and these are the increases in relative fiber size we see over 20 weeks, right? In another group of women, so these were different subjects. So this was not the same group of subjects. They measured them at 6 weeks and then at 20. Different group of subjects. So that's a limitation to this. But these data were there, and I kind of had fun analyzing this. We see gains in these first 6 weeks. Pretty substantial. By the way, here's this training regimen. They trained the heck out of them. They trained legs twice a week using squats, leg presses, and knee extensions. And they're taking biopsies from the lateralis, so a quad muscle. First training session, they did 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps to failure on each exercise. It's pretty brutal. And then the second training session, so this is like a Monday, and this was a Friday, I believe. Again, 3 sets, each exercise, this time 10 to 12 reps to failure, with a 10 to 12 rep range for each exercise. So they trained them pretty hard. And the thing that has to be noted here is that over the course of time, the percentage of these type 2 and type 2AX and 2X fibers, or 2AB and B as they called them, those changed, right? So, for instance, especially here, the type 2B, or what we call now type 2X fibers, this almost immaterial. There was a good number of them here, but here the percentage was drastically lower. These vanish pretty much over time if you really train and activate them. You don't, that type of myosin isoform isn't expressed in muscle that's been trained substantially.
Okay.
So what I did was I had to do a fiber type percentage weighted increase. And what I did is I compared the 6-week period of training here.
Okay.
And knowing what these fiber type percentages were, pre versus post, and did the same thing for 20 weeks and got a weighted average of the fiber cross-sectional area growth and compared 20 weeks with 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, they had about a 19% increase in fiber cross-sectional area. In 20 weeks, 29%. This means they got about 2/3 of their growth within the first third of the training period.
Wow.
So they grew a lot faster initially. Different groups of individuals. So I misspoke there in that they said they, but the group that trained for just 6 weeks, there was also another subset, kind of a complicated study, and that's a whole other topic. But the 6 weeks, when we make this comparison, same training regimen, same population they sampled from, we presume that the women in the 20-week training period were similar to those in the 6-week training period. They're making their gains much more rapidly in the first 6 weeks in those women who did that versus those who trained for 20 weeks. Law of diminishing returns. So this is what you see when you look at individual studies, where they make these measurements, generally speaking. There are also studies where if they make mid-training measurements, some individuals come up and then they go backwards. That can happen. The thing is, with studies like this, most people nowadays, I don't know about you, Scott, but how often have you trained 20 weeks right in a row?
Yeah.
Without taking a deload?
Yeah, there's usually some sort of deload involved there, isn't there?
Yeah, so there's issues with all of this, but these are just a couple examples. And we go back to the previous slide. They had those a 6-week and then a 3-week deload. The 3-week deload didn't impair their overall growth when it came down to it. They're just doing bench pressing, so there's a limitation there. But that's probably longer than most people would need the deload. But anyway, there's a possibility that if people don't self-regulate how hard they're training and they just go for broke like an absolute maniac for 20 weeks straight, that could also be what's slowing the gains here in the second half.
That makes sense.
That's a possibility, but in general, some evidence here for this law of diminishing returns.
Why, hello! I wanted to do something different with my True Nutrition advertisement for today. And here's the thing, I just got our order in. Victoria and I, we pay for all the protein that we get. They don't send us anything for free. And that's because I've believed in True Nutrition for 15 years now. I've been using them ever since I contest prep. They have some of the cleanest, best quality protein. A lot of times I use the Team Skip, but here's the deal. I'm going back to the Pure Whey Isolate. The Pure Whey Isolate, it just processes so fast. This is my favorite flavor, chocolate peanut butter cup. But if you want to try just like 1 pound at a time, you can do that. Just sample it. I've never had the cookie butter, so I'm going to try the cookie butter this week. We got a big old bag of pea protein isolate. For the wife, this is what she likes to use. And here's the thing, they're just about wholesale prices at True Nutrition. Plus, they don't add the flavor in when they weigh it. So you get like legit 1 pound of protein, and then from there they add the flavor after that. So every 1 pound, I think it's like 1.2. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. But hey, here's the thing, True Nutrition is a great quality protein. They believe in us. They advertise with us because I literally asked them to. And if you use our code THINK, you'll get some additional savings. Plus, of course, that's like voting for our podcast. So thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed my my impromptu ad. Goodbye.
So I came across this meta-analysis from Benito et al. 2020. I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere online. Someone probably has, but it never it's not something that people have been just like talking about. It's not taking the internet by storm. Overall, they had 111 studies and nearly 2,000 subjects that they analyzed. They're about 25 years old, roughly 80 kilograms, and they looked at fat-free mass, lean muscle mass, and skeletal muscle mass. So depending on what the outcome measure was, they looked at these different outcome measures. I've got a graph here of fat-free mass, which we'll get into in just a second. So basic interesting finding, it's somewhat off topic for what we're talking about, but relevant, is that the gains that were seen in this study were not associated with anything. The duration of the study, the volume, basically nothing. There was no relationship with the gains except for the number of sets per workout. The more sets per workout, the lower the muscle growth, which sort of suggests that there's a junk volume issue here. You try to do, all 20 sets for the week in one workout. That's not a good thing. So those programs where people are doing too many sets per workout, according to this meta-analysis, are the ones that aren't going to turn on growth because they're probably digging too much of a recovery hole to climb out of. But the most important thing, and this is the plot that they put, there was no statistical relationship here. But what they did is they were able to categorize their participants. In this case, they plotted for fat-free mass. So this was the outcome measure in these studies. This represents 951 subjects across, I think, like 55 studies, maybe something like that. No, it wasn't 55. It's 80 something, 83. And they have actually, they had a group, there was a control group that did nothing.
Yeah.
And then they had 5 training groups. So the sedentary group actually made some progress here in general. These are studies where they may have some nutritional interventions and they're comparing training and no training. There's a number of things that could explain this. It's not a big point. But what's most important here is they had groups that were untrained. So these are our total newbie novices. And then those who had trained more than a year, but not up to 2 years, more than 2 years, but up to 3 years, up to 4 years, and then those who had trained 4 years or more.
Yeah.
So these are our newbies. These are our moderately trained. These are better trained. These are at it for 3 years, and here's 4 years plus.
Okay.
Now, they did mention this just numerically. This average is higher. There's also a huge standard deviation bar there. But basically, they kind of fit a curve here. There is no law of diminishing returns occurring here. If this were the case, we would expect this to happen. This would be our curve. It would look something like that, where the most advanced individuals aren't making nearly the gains that you see in the untrained individuals.
Yeah.
If anything, it looks like it wasn't statistically significant, but it looks like it's kind of going the other way, especially when we compare this 3 to 4 years with the 4-year plus group. So we'll just take this for what the statistics suggested, that there was no relationship between training experience and gains in fat-free mass when that was the outcome measure. that they used. And they found no relationship for lean muscle mass, skeletal muscle mass, anything that was in there in meta-analysis. And in this case, they plotted fat-free mass to demonstrate this. Flabbergasting, So they quoted, like as I mentioned before, the authors note that fat-free mass gains were quantitatively greatest and the most advanced. Interesting enough, the standard deviation bar dips below negative in some of these middle categories. So this happens in studies. Like this means, we went through this before, the standard deviation, 68%, 95, etc. This means that there were studies where people made no gains, which is what you might expect. There's perhaps even more so here in the 3+ years. Even in, you're not going to get that so much in the untrained individuals, but even in individuals who are trained between 1 and 2 years, there's going to be a good number of people here who made no gains in these resistance training studies.
Yeah. So
some subjects are quote unquote losing fat-free mass. And one of the reasons that might be is someone comes into a study, and we're going to get into this, where they're like, I'm not making the gains I want to make. I'm going to enter this study because they're going to have maybe some magic bullet in there training-wise that I can do or what have you, and they get into a less optimal program and maybe they detrain to some degree. Okay. That's possible.
Yeah.
I think if anything, what we have is exactly the opposite of that, because our most trained individuals are making newbie gains when they get into studies.
Okay. Huh.
This is what we're seeing. In fact, this standard deviation bar did not dip below 0. This is the most impressive of all those values, I would say, of the standard deviation bars. I covered them up or larger. But our most trained individuals are making gains in fat-free mass equivalent to those of the completely untrained individuals.
And that's not what you normally hear. You normally hear, well, these studies were done on untrained individuals, so of course they gained.
Right. This is why this meta-analysis is so interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm not making this data up. This isn't like one particular study. This is what's seen when you look at the collective whole of the studies that met the inclusion criteria for their meta-analysis, that they were not finding any association with any of their outcome measures for muscle mass between training experience and the gains in any of those outcome measures.
Yeah.
So it didn't matter. The law of diminishing returns was not demonstrable in these data amongst these 111 studies, regardless of which outcome measure they used for muscle mass.
That's wild.
So why is this? What's going on here? It's just pretty wild, right?
Yeah.
So if advanced subjects still make newbie better gains in research studies, that's important to say, because this is the contrast I'm trying to make here, is that we don't see this in the real world when people are training out in gyms, right? And we all have our own biased lens. The people who are listening here have probably optimized a lot of their training variables much better than maybe the average gym goer.
If they're listening to this, they have,
Absolutely. Well, they've already met that criterion of watching the Think Big Network podcast.
Yes.
So
yeah.
They've already you guys will just turn off because you've already maximized your game. You're at your limit, so there's nothing to be had here. Everyone go home. Nothing to learn. So some thoughts on this.
Yeah.
It seems there could be very much, because of this contrast between what we've all experienced and seems to be the case in the real world, that there's a selection bias in these studies. So advanced trainees are perhaps a specific subset of the quote-unquote advanced or the trained population. They seem to be those who still have a lot of room to grow. So imagine you're a subject coming in and you're trying to figure out how to make progress. The progress you made has not been satisfactory. We could be talking about people who just haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah.
And it could be those who could have used some help, benefit from some basic solid programming, and they want to pay attention to science. And today, even they're confused by all the different things that different influencers say. They're like, I'm going to just get into a study and actually do something that's scientifically programmed.
Yeah.
Right? Alternatively, do truly advanced, committed, quote unquote, successful trainees want to submit themselves to a study, right?
Right.
So you've already got your training, you're happy with what you're doing, you're monitoring everything, you're in it, you've got your mojo working. You don't all of a sudden want to say, okay, yeah, just throw me into, maybe I'll be in the placebo group, maybe I won't be, I'm going to have to do your training program as opposed to mine. like people don't want to give up control. People who have good control over their training may also tend to be, for lack of a scientific term, control freaks of a certain nature who don't want to actually submit to a study. So you don't see those people in these studies. So they're not willing to give up a program they work so hard to. And they may already be doing what the study is testing, so using creatine or what have you. It could be that they're already doing these things. So sometimes that's an exclusion. You don't want to bring people in and you can't examine the effect of creatine of someone who's been taking creatine for 5 years straight, right?
Right.
Or potentially they're not drug-free. So that's a huge exclusion criterion too.
They're not telling the studies that they're the study people that they're juiced up.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, and I would love to see, maybe there's some psychological literature that has sort of teased this apart, but you sometimes see camps. The drug-using bodybuilders are more like just go in there and hammer it home and go old school and just get strong and just eat as much as you need to eat, etc. And then the guys that don't have that to leverage their growth say, I'm going to try to be as scientifically sound as I possibly can. I'm still going to train hard and eat as much as possible without getting too fat, etc., etc. But you've got maybe a different mindset amongst drug-using bodybuilders and natural bodybuilders. The natural ones are going to go into the studies, and the drug-using are not. So, but those who are drug-using and then are scientifically inclined, they're going to be like, I'm not going to do that because I know I'm going to mess up the study.
Yeah.
Right?
Hopefully.
So they're at least honest. So there's various potential possibilities. But if they come in and they say, they ask you, and literally you're sitting there with an investigator and he looks at you and you're looking at this dude who's, 5'7" and he's 215 at 8% body fat. You're like, so have you ever used steroids? And you're like, no. It's like, I don't believe you. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, heck, we had a guy, for my dissertation, we had a guy who was taking albuterol for asthma.
Right.
And we excluded him.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's not WADA approved, blah, blah, blah. So, it might influence. And basically, he would not be of the population of people that we were trying to study. Drug-free, taking no performance-enhancing substances are known to potentially impact muscle mass, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So we didn't want to have him in there.
Yeah,
seems,
makes sense.
So that can happen too. So, and how many of these subjects are truly advanced in terms of sometimes, should have been continuously training for 2 years. It's like, I take a month off here and there. And
yeah, how advanced is advanced?
How advanced are they? So, have they really been banging away, haven't missed a workout since 1982, that sort of thing. You don't know this. So that could be a reason why they still have some room to grow when they enter the study. But the other question people can ask is, if you go into your typical commercial gym, what percentage of people are training at a high level, taking their sets to failure? You're like, there's not another rep, and there's no way this guy's getting another rep. Or alternatively, you see there's no way this guy's getting another rep, and he gets another rep, and then he gets another, or she. You're like, that's an animal. Oh my God.
Yeah.
You don't see that very often.
No, and you don't see it often. And as you were kind of already saying too, I don't suspect that that's the person that's going to give up control of what they're doing to do a study that might not yield as good results as what they think they can get either, on their own.
Right. So that's the point, is that the people who are doing that stay in the commercial gyms and do what they're doing. But many people who have been training for a long while aren't doing these things. They're not training to failure. They're not progressively overloading using a logbook.
Yeah.
Or not following a specific program that they tailored to themselves. So when you get into a scientific study, they do progressive overload. We had a whole kind of podcast section on that. That's one of the basic tenets of how these resistance, whatever the other parameters may be, progressive overload is a basic commandment of creating research or resistance training studies.
Yeah.
You have that in there. It's just a basic way. That's part of the documentation in the methods sections. So are we training heavy enough? And I mentioned this before on a study. So this is a study, a meta-analysis by Steele et al. And studies where a 1RM was tested and where trained and untrained subjects self-selected their own training loads. Let me get to the figures here. There it is. So the self-selected loads, just in general, so they were just asked to pick their loads in these studies.
Yeah.
Only 368 subjects, but basically self-selected loads for trained and untrained individuals were both less than 55% of a 1 rep max.
And I think we have talked about this before once. Yeah.
We have, but I think it's important to bring up. So
Absolutely.
People go in and you say, pick your training load.
Yeah.
Whatever the circumstances are, sometimes the reps, there's a number of different studies. They pick a load that's pretty light, that's going to equate to at least a 15 or 20 rep max set, if not more.
Yeah.
Right? If they did a 1 rep max test beforehand, this increased the load. It wasn't significant by like 2 or 3%.
It's nothing.
Yeah, so like they went from like 55% to 57%, right? So like, oh yeah, I think I'm a little strong. So even then, it didn't make that much of a difference. But that's just a 1 RM. And just an aside here, when people talk about strength, like that first slide, the figure from the ACSM position stand, or in other meta-analysis, strength it's an MV, a maximal voluntary contraction, all out, isometric, or typically a 1 rep max, which is a different outcome measure than what actually is being trained. If you're training for a 1 rep max, it's a powerlifting study, or you actually go and have people just do 1 rep max, you can get good at those pretty well, actually. As you can actually get as good at a 1 rep max just by doing 1 rep maxes and not doing any of the other training as you can with training, at least over the short term.
Yeah.
The 1 rep max is nice. It's a traditional measure, but it isn't what matters the most. I've been saying this for years and years now. What matters most to me is the training loads that are used and how those are progressed. So the 1 rep max thing, it does tell us what relative load we're using, but when you look at that as an outcome measure for a training regime where 1 rep max was not a goal that was set, the goal was not to improve the 1 rep max.
Yeah.
The training wasn't set up to taper down for a 1 rep max or what have you. Its relevance is minimal in my mind. So here's another figure from that meta-analysis and they had a number of different scenarios. So this graph's kind of funky, but if you look at this is the number of repetitions that were performed in these sets versus the percentage of the 1 rep max. So you can see a lot of these studies, or the dots represent studies, and the size of the dots represents the number of people in the study. You can see a lot of these studies were centered around a 10 rep per set. And here we see, again, about 53% of a 1 rep max is what people were choosing when they were asked to do 10 rep sets. Standard 3 sets of 10 type of scenario. So when you say we're looking for about 10 reps and people choose 53% of a 1 rep max, this is just, and some of these were trained, others were untrained, right? They're leaving at least 5 reps in reserve here.
Yeah.
There's a wide, there are studies where people are like, this is more appropriate, right? And then there were some studies where people are picking, they're around like 30%, right? So it's all over the place. This is another potential critique, is like, what's going on in the culture of that lab, or with those subjects that come in? Maybe these are older folks, that's a possibility, who are very scared of the eye. They have a fragility type of mindset. Mm-hmm. So they're like, I'm going to pick something really light because these guys are really going to push me and I want to make sure I can bail and this is going to hurt and blah, blah, blah. There's various reasons, but wide range there. But on average, we're talking many, many reps in reserve for a lot of these studies, especially when people are going at less than 55% of a 1 rep max. So they're leaving far too many reps in reserve. At least was when people were habitually allowed to choose. So another interesting study here from Mansfield that came out 5 years ago now. They had trained subjects here, so greater than 2 years of training. Body weight was 190, so this isn't bad for naturals. This is a decent body weight. Their bench 1 rep max was 216. So take that for what it's worth. And what they did was ask them to self-assess their reps in reserve mid-set when doing sets to failure at both 60% of 1 rep max and 80. So that's what these plots are here. So They were asked for reps mid-set, so on the 8th repetition with the 60% of a 1 rep max load. So they had already tested their 1 rep max to know what this load is, right? They would ask them how many you got left, right? And on the 3rd repetition, when using the 80% of 1 rep max load. So this is going to be like 8 reps, something like that. We can see here. Actually, this doesn't show it, but so this is a pretty heavy load. This is what you maybe could get. Depends on the exercise. In this case, they're using a bench press. So they did 3 sets, as I said. I think they had, I mentioned it, 3 minutes of rest. So here's what happened. Set number 1, we'll look at the 60%, so the lighter scenario, 6% of a 1 rep max. It's about a 15 rep max.
Okay.
Right? When they get mid-set, and these data points here are for each of the individuals to say, how many reps do you have in reserve? And the average person is saying, I got about 6. And then when they ask them to take the set to failure, they're getting about 13.
Oh, wow.
So there's about a 7 rep difference. They go mid-set, they say, what do you got left? They think they got 6, and they double that. Right? Or more. Then they rest, they do a 2nd set, and they do the same thing. They ask them after the 8th rep, of course, now this is later in the set because they're fatigued. This is their estimated reps in reserve, and this is how much they actually got. So they got much better when they were later on because they'd already had a failure set. They said, okay, I know what I'm going to get. I know what failure feels like, right? I got a better idea because I've just done a set to failure. And also they're asking them every time on the 8th rep. So they're almost to failure when they ask them to estimate. So it's no wonder that these values are much closer. So by the 3rd set, they're basically, they got it down, right? So they're pretty much close to failure when they ask them to estimate their failure. So yeah, if you got 2 reps left and you say how many you got left, and I think I got 2, and then you'll get 2 or probably maybe 3 or only 1. But if you're mid-set, you can't tell so well. The thing is, most of the time, and this is kind of a point I'm extrapolating or trying to draw from this, is that from the previous slide too, people will pick a weight and they have a rep number in their head and they just do those reps with the weight they picked. They don't go mid-set and think, how many have I got left? And if they do and they're fresh, they drastically underestimate. So reps in reserve can be problematic, especially if you're doing this without having had, in this case, a previous set where you went to failure. Here's the 80% run rep max. So this is a 6 to 8 rep max for a bench press. And they were a little bit better here. So they asked them how many you got left. I got 3.5 or 4. They'd say 3 or 4 here, and they'd actually get 6. So they're still off by more than 50%, right? But these are heavier and they're closer to failure, especially later on here, right? So they're deeper into a set, or I wouldn't say they're closer to failure. They've got fewer reps in reserve, so to speak, because it's a heavier set. They're just going to get fewer reps, so they are technically closer to failure. So they learned their lesson. So the question is, without achieving failure, how well can you estimate your reps in reserve? If you're not noting your actual performance previously, mid-set reps in reserve may underestimate the 2 reps in reserve. So the thing is, if you're not logbooking this and paying attention, like these individuals are acutely aware, this is the task at hand, is to estimate what their reps in reserve are. And they're horrible at it in the first set, and then they get better. But if they weren't paying attention, they hadn't written down, okay, I just got 16 reps. I should get 13 or 14 this, and I went to failure, right? So context makes a difference, I think.
Yeah.
So leading up to we're getting close. There's a couple more interesting slides, but how can we ensure our training effort? Well, if you're using reps in reserve without a true failure in point, so you don't really know what your actual reps in reserve are because you didn't go to failure, according to this study, you can dramatically underestimate it, right? So let's say they say, take your set to 3 reps in reserve, and you never go to failure. Well, your 3 reps in reserve might actually be truly 6 reps in reserve.
And that's for trained and untrained people.
Yeah, in this case, these were trained subjects.
Yeah.
These are people, and it's going to be probably worse for untrained people.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
that's the big thing, that we always say is like, in order to know what you're going to do. In order to know reps in reserve, you have to know failure. That's always been the big caveat we talk about on the show. But hey, even if you are trained and you are experienced, it still doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to know.
Yeah, I mean, these guys weren't super strong. Like, bench press was not much over their body weight, but they've been at it for a couple of years. They've been training. So, but how can you ensure your training effort using a logbook? is the one? Oops, hold on just a sec. I lost my pointer. There it is. It goes between screens. So using a logbook, you get feedback from your progressive overload, your reps reserve, or nowadays people use apps, right? Yeah. I'm not a big fan of the apps. I prefer to use auto-regulate. The phone. I think phones can be a distraction too, unless like the app like will automatically turn off your notifications, for instance, and you can focus. But the phone is such a symbiote and maybe a parasite for some people that I think how many times you go in, you see people are just like staring at their phone. It's like, where's your mindset? Like, where's your mental imagery? Where's your focus?
Sure, I got you.
There's lots of things. That's a whole other topic, but or you can just train to failure very close to it, right? Yeah. So you go in, if you don't have to estimate, you just go like within 1, 2, or 0 reps in reserve, and then you don't make these issues. And then again, the question: how often do you see one or more of these 3 things in the gym? Right? People training with a logbook or close to failure or an app or what have you.
Yeah.
You don't see this. You don't see it very often. So. Hold on just a sec. I'll just get all this out here. So this is another meta-aggression. This one came out. This was the talk of the town. Robinson et al. In 2024. Okay. 55 studies here. They averaged about 8 weeks. Basically, what they've done is they've statistically controlled for training status here. That's our main question about training status, duration, et cetera, and come up with this plot showing, and it's an interesting plot, estimated proximity to failure. So they have this in their methods. They were very, very clever about looking at individual studies and figuring out in the different scenarios how close to failure the subjects actually were based on the load or based on other conditions in the study, and they were able to come up with an estimated reps in reserve for these 55 studies that they had here. And so they have an estimated proximity to failure reps in reserve and the percent change in muscle size. So this is just a general outcome measure for percent change in muscle size. And the big talk of the town was that we see a slope here. And of course, once again, the data are all over the place, right? Huge, broad, sweeping bands of standard deviation, of standard error bars. But in general, the closer, when we go from right to left, this brings us to a value of 0 reps in reserve. And of course, we have this wonderful point here where these people had a negative 20% change in muscle size in this study. That's definitely an outlier. But the closer we come to 0 reps in reserve, so the closer we come to failure or the point before failure, the greater the increases in muscle size, right? Interestingly enough, if we look at these studies, we're also seeing that you can go out here to 2, 4, 6, beyond this sort of magical or somewhat arbitrary, but I understand the reason behind it, reps in reserve value of 5 reps in reserve being the cutoff for when they become effective. If you look at, as a whole, these studies, you can be out at 6 reps in reserve. Out here, you can be at 8 reps in reserve, and you can actually make some gains, right? Not as much. I'm kind of tracing across here. Your gains might be half at 8 reps in reserve than they are when you go to 0 reps in reserve. But the question is, especially thinking about advanced trainees, does this pass the reality test, right? So obviously in some of these cases, like, I don't imagine if you're doing a 10 rep max load, that you can train with 8 reps in reserve and just do sets of 2, right, and get much growth. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
However, this is the training loads that were used. So some of these were very light load training, but most of the studies used more than 70% of 1 rep max. So this is mostly heavy training, right? And it suggests that you could, for many people training at 70, 80 plus % of a 1 rep max, that you can get muscle growth pretty far from failure, which is really quite interesting. So these subjects, and again, this meta regression statistically controlled for training status as well. I think they used just a 0 or a 1, untrained or trained.
Okay.
So they didn't try to differentiate this. I would have loved if they had done that. That was a data point, characteristic they could have extracted. A lot more work, of course. And maybe I'm sure they have that somewhere. Maybe there's another paper on the way out. I would love to see that. But this is just when you sort of control for training status. And from the Benito study, it doesn't make a difference anyway. This is what you see, that you can be way away from failure. So this is past the reality test. If you're training, for instance, 70% of a 1 rep max, or 75%, right? And you're leaving 5 to 10 reps in reserve, how are we making gains? So this again, like, calls into question, like, what's going on in these studies? Who are they bringing in that they can make gains so easily, training so far from failure? It's still better when you get closer, according to this analysis.
Yeah.
Right? The closer you are to failure, when you get to 0 reps, that's better for you. But you can be way away from that and still do pretty good for yourself.
Which is hopeful for guys like me who really can't go to failure, you know?
Yeah, but I think you're pretty close, and you make up for that with volume, to some degree. But yes, but this I think really speaks to the nature of the subjects that are in these studies very often.
Okay, yeah.
Unfortunately, this was an analysis of the advanced. So how do we make sense of this? What the hell's going on here, so to speak? I don't know exactly, but I have some thoughts. Again, we may have some selection bias. Coloring the studies with advanced trainees. We've got trained, moderately trained, experienced, truly advanced, elite. Where do these folks fall, right? And if you look and read and oftentimes this isn't really well documented, but you can read the data and get an idea how strong people are. For instance, if they have a 1 rep max test, you can get an idea of how advanced these folks are. But these advanced or trained experienced may be less advanced or trained than you. The people who are listening to this, and this is an important feature to keep in mind. This doesn't mean that what happens in a study with advanced people where they make really good gains has absolutely no value. If there is a difference, let's say they trained one way versus another and it helped, that is suggestive of us in the context of that study. There's an advantage there. To what extent that might help you, because you could say, come from a different population of people. You're not making gains at 6 reps in reserve. Yeah. Right? You're having to force things by training close to failure and be very, very diligent with your progressive overload, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe the training effort was potentially lacking in these incoming advanced subjects. I kind of alluded to this earlier. Was the progressive overload and hard training maybe is the reason for making progress in these testing conditions? Were these people just floundering out in their gyms and not making sense of things? They're like, I'm going to get in a study and maybe that'll set me on track. And now they have to train progressively. Yeah. First time in a long while. I don't know. The other thing, interestingly, the training condition, you really can't blind the training condition. They can do some really cool things, for instance, where you train one leg one way and train the other leg another way, right? So high reps with one leg, lower reps with another leg, or to failure with one leg, or not to failure with one leg. Yeah. So that can also have, like, if you don't like training to failure, and because it's just you don't like the feeling of having to push that hard, there's a possibility that you have an internal issue with training to failure. Mm-hmm. That's part of what is being tested in the study, actually. But otherwise, if we're comparing groups of people, we don't have an internal control like that. And you know that this study is, let's just use the example of training the stretch position, or using drop sets versus straight sets, or higher frequency or whatever. And maybe you're talking with, because you're a curious person, you're scientifically oriented, you went into the study to learn more, and you're talking about why one particular training regime might be advantageous versus another. and you know you're in the group where you got the good training regime, that could influence how you train and what you do. The other way around, you can have Rosenthal effects where the experimenter's expectancy could affect the outcome, right? If they know you're in the control group, because you're not blind to the training regime, right? You know what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know, so you're not blinded to that. You can blind a pill, right? You don't know whether they got the creatine or the placebo, what have you. But when you're talking about different training, so that could potentially be impacting things as well in certain conditions. But just being in there with an experimental as well, I don't think I mentioned this explicitly, can impact things. Now you've got someone watching you.
Yeah.
You got to prove yourself to someone.
Yeah, that's big sometimes.
Having all the regimen. Yeah. But being in a study where you're potentially in the group that's going to make better gains, that could influence, at least for that group, what kind of progress you make, and that could be something that wasn't in effect previously if you've never done a study before. But for those who don't make gains this easily, as I mentioned before, you may not clearly benefit from intervention if you've been exploiting multiple avenues and training progressively and hard. Right? So for the advanced people who aren't going to gain like this after 5+ or 4+ years of training, it's just not going to happen because you've done all these things.
Yeah.
Potentially, one way, shape, or form. So the question for people listening, do you have room for improvement? Are you potentially in some way, shape, or form like the individuals in the Benito study who have been training for years and years and years who make newbie gains when they get into a study? Are you training too light? Do you self-select loads that are less than 60% of your 1-rep max and do sets of 10 with them? Are you training hard enough? Are you using reps in reserve training without a failure set? This may predispose you to lack of appropriate load adjustment. If you're always leaving reps in the tank, you don't know how full the tank can get. You don't know how many reps you could get. So bottom line here is, I think having some sort of I call it a performance anchor to know where your maximal performance is. So a logbook to help you guide progressive overload, where you must put in the effort to progress. At some point in time, you can, of course, do progressive overload with reps in reserve. Potentially falls prey to these issues with estimating your reps in reserve. But if you have that at least as a guide, there will be some progressive overload. And at least one failure set may help gauge the reps in reserve.
Yeah.
A preceding failure set will affect the following set performance too. And I think using a final failure set that you log is a great way to do this. Right? This is when you hit that failure set, that will impact the performance thereafter.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure on that, and generally too. But let's say you're doing sets of 10 or 12, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to go to failure, and you get 16, and you thought, wow, I didn't know I had that in me.
Mm-hmm.
Doing that repeatedly teaches you, okay, now I know really how close I am to failure. And having the logbook to guide your progressive overload combines the best of many worlds there. So, and the other, this is, I kind of said this facetiously, but if you just do all working sets to failure or 0 reps in reserve, this really kind of eliminates the uncertainty there, right? You can't go any harder, but it means you got to train harder, of course. Some people don't want to do that per se if they don't have that mindset, but you also have to train smarter too. And it may not be optimal for everyone. There may be something, I've built this in the fortitude to some degree, where not all sets are taken to failure. There may be an accumulation of volume that's important, but when in doubt, that's one way to something to test out. If you're thinking, wow, I think I've been leaving a lot in the tank, switch to a program for some period of time where you have to auto-regulate. You take your sets to failure or 0 reps in reserve. That's much safer, and it pretty much gets you where you need to go, right? And it eliminates that uncertainty. If you're unsure, just go to failure or 0 reps in reserve, where going beyond that would not make sense. It would be silly and dangerous and unnecessary. So
there's the crew.
There's the crew. Yep. And I do seminars if people would be interested in one of those. So a little advertising.
You do amazing seminars, actually. I said it last time too, Scott, that every time I've been to one of your seminars, I've always picked something up. In fact, I can say that about everything we do on the show, even that these podcasts, I might not get it all, but there's some bits of take home that I always am going to consider. I think the big one for me in this is that difference, because like I said, every time we ever talk about studies ever, they always say, well, it's not with trained individuals. And this kind of really opens my eyes that maybe it doesn't matter if it's, what is a trained individual? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I picture something in my head. When I think of a trained individual, this is, people that we would consider hard training. This is Kuba getting into a study. You know what I mean?
Right. And but Kuba is not going to. He's not going to match the subject criteria. He's not going to. He's going to be excluded immediately. Right.
But I think that's what we imagine is, and that's the extreme, right? You know what I mean? But we imagine somebody who's like really lifting hard. That's what trained is. Somebody we respect what their training mindset is versus trained individual. Maybe that guy in the gym who's been working out for 4 years and not made any progress at all in the last 2.
Yeah, and so it shines an interesting light. I had not seen that data until I was reviewing an article and I saw that site. I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. That this is what we see across the training experience, and I hate to say it, but I love the idea of we're going to try to have better external validity and we're going to bring in trained individuals. I think it's better to have trained people than untrained people. Sure. All other things being equal. But the interesting thing, and this could be documented in some way, is, or you could just simply ask, why are you doing this study? Why are you here? And if the question is, I'm not making any gains and I should be, and I've been at this for 3 years so far and I'm confused and bewildered, that's worth knowing. Yeah. Reason for entry, right? I mean, you have a study of obesity and you give them, a GLP-1 agonist or what have you, like, why they're there. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And those are maybe people who haven't been, the people who enter those studies who have obesity, we kind of know, well, they haven't been able to lose weight otherwise. Yeah. In many cases, they've been at it for a while. And sometimes that's part of the study design, is to pick people. But I don't think, and I could be very wrong here, but I don't think that when the researchers are recruiting advanced individuals, they're not intentionally trying to find the unsuccessful advanced trainees. But the Benito study suggests the possibility that there's a selection bias, as I noted, for those studies with advanced trainees, that we're getting the ones who have a lot of room for improvement. And that helps with the study, because then you can see an effect of the training. Yeah. As you saw in that last, the reps and reserve meta-regression curve, it's like there's some studies where people don't, and a couple of the plots, people don't make any gains. The Benito study too, people don't go anywhere. So it's kind of all over the place. But it's a tough thing because, like I said, you go into a gym, and I got some good people in my dissertation. But part of what we did is we said, you can keep doing your regular training, and we want you to maintain your regular training for the leg. We wanted you to just keep that in place, and then we put the E-stem on top of that, and just trained one leg and had a control leg. So we had a control leg that was undergoing some semblance of its other length, but we didn't interrupt their training, so we got advanced people. Yeah, and all these guys were pretty well. Were advanced. There was not anyone who wasn't pretty impressive. They're the ones that you go in the gym like, okay, that's the upper 10%. Okay, yeah, top percentiles. But when you have someone who weighs on average 190 and they're benching 216 or whatever the value was, that's not horrible. That's not beginner, but that's not someone who's been trying to improve their bench press for 4 years straight. These are people who've been at it for 2 years. So yeah, it's a tough quandary. I think there could be cases, and it would help to understand the nature of the study to say, okay, we took what we thought were advanced subjects and they made newbie gains based on what we see in the literature. Right. We asked them ahead of time, why were you here? How many gains have you made in the past year? Have you ever used a training log? Like, looked at their training program and did an assessment of it and used a scale ranking. Well constructed, not well constructed, scientifically sound principles, really well constructed, whatever, some sort of a Likert scale or what have you, and say these guys were lost souls, right, who hadn't been making any progress, or these guys really had it going on and they came to us, or maybe it was a broad spectrum. And then you could then do a statistical analysis and say, okay, we analyze them based on use of a logbook or not use of a logbook. And the individuals had been using a logbook, made basically, they were categorically different, and there was a statistically significant difference between logbook users and non-logbook users in our study. Those who used logbooks had been progressively overloading. They're using a logbook. Those who hadn't were doing it for the first time, and they made gains. It's a basic intake data point that could be used to understand the nature of those advanced subjects. And like I said, it's typically poorly documented. It's hard to get people into these studies, man. Like it was a nightmare for me, and I've just done it a few times for the studies that in grad school and thereafter. But you get all sorts of like wacky people calling you, trying to get in stuff. It's just like
I was wondering how that looked. Like, who are the people that are actually seeking out these studies to enter? I mean, I imagine if you're at a school, I could see it being posted up around school and a lot of students. But then if you're looking for people that are of an older age, then that might kind of take some of the students out of a lot of the students out of the demographic. And
they often document that if they went out off university, off campus to do so. Okay. But a lot of times, like, that's why the studies will run 12 weeks, because that's how long the semester is, right? And they have, like, for instance, the study from Starin et al. with the women, the 20 versus 6 weeks. Yeah. They had, like, in that 6-week group, they had some that came in. Well, they had the 20-week group, and then they detrained them and they retrained them. But the reason they had to stop was because they had like a summer break. And the detraining period was the duration of the summer break. Right. And the reason for they had in the 6-week group, some of them stopped after 6 weeks, and some will want to continue, and I think maybe they live locally and they didn't go home for the break or whatever. Right. So the nature of those studies, how they're sort of temporally constructed, is based on whether they're on a cohort system or a semester. If you're an exercise scientist, you at least want to be on a semester system, because you can do if you want to do training studies, you can do longer studies because you have longer terms and there's no break. Yeah. So it gets very difficult, and it's almost an outlier to get someone who's over 30. It's usually like a graduate student or maybe a young faculty member or something like that. Okay. But often that's why they're in their 20s. It's almost always in their 20s, or males in their 20s who do this. So
amazing. That's something we never really talk about, who these study participants are.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that those students would already be more inclined to be involved with exercise or interested in exercise, have maybe some background in, maybe they played sports in high school, versus over in the liberal arts building where they're studying film and painting and drawing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's if sometimes the untrained are hard to find. I mean, sometimes they go into like PE classes. Okay. You can get extra credit in your PE class. Yeah. If you join, or the exercise science majors do it.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That happens a lot. You'll have like very resistance trained. It's like the guy who played football and baseball, or he wrestled in high school, and he's been lifting. He's a sophomore now. He's been lifting, for that period of time, but he's just futzing around.
Yeah, he's doing the stuff that he learned in high school weight room.
And he's trained. Yeah. I mean, there are like Ed Coyle's lab. This is a different area, but Ed Coyle, he did a lot of cycling research. And he had, when I was at University of Texas at Austin, he had a total of 5 or 6 graduate students. Okay. And they were the subject in their studies. And they basically it was an unwritten mandate in the lab that they needed to maintain a high VO2 max. They needed to be aerobically cycle trained so that they could fit the criteria for a highly trained cyclist for their studies. And they always had subjects because they had indentured servitude in the graduate students who were always there. So they're like, hey, like let's do let's do this study. Of course, they had to get review. You know, the Human Subjects Committee had to give them approval, whatever. But they could just, it's like, hey, let's test something out. Let's see what happens if we give you glycerol, right? When you're on this cycle, 30 minutes in, does it change your respiratory exchange ratio or whatever? Like, we'll just do it. Like, we got some in the lab right here. You know, I ordered some, and they'd put on the indirect calorimetry, and they just do it because they have the subjects. They could do entire studies and series of studies because they had their own subjects.
Yeah.
And they had to maintain their training regimen. So these guys, I mean, I remember seeing them, like, they're sitting there like cycling and they're studying papers and stuff. They're in grad school, and they're just, all I got to do is keep the wheels moving.
Yeah.
But you know, that's kind of extraordinary because they had really tight control on their training status, on their training regimes, and so that helps statistically. So they can do studies with small numbers of people. When you're trying to recruit from the population, you have one guy comes in, right, and you know, he's done like 4 natural competitions, and he's, you know, getting after it. He's like literally a competitive bodybuilder at a high level, and he's only been doing it for 4 years, right? And the other guy comes in and he lifted in high school, you know, and he played baseball, but he really didn't lift that much, and he's just been lifting on and off, like kind of continuously.
Also a trained individual, though.
Also trained, and like these people are worlds apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the one guy, you know, that's why asking about a logbook, asking about the nature of their training, you know, would make sense to explain why we see this craziness in this Benito meta-analysis where the most trained people are making newbie gains in these studies. But you know, the positive of this is that I think it's possible if you look at. I don't think all of these people are lost souls coming into these studies. I think there's some people who have been doing a lot of things right, and that would, you know, we don't know what their demographics are, but I think this may apply to some people who are listeners who've been doing a lot of things right, and maybe they've just never used, like, I don't want to buy that person's app. That guy's just trying to, like, you know, make my wallet flatter. I don't believe it, you know, blah, blah, blah. Try the app or get a logbook. Or maybe do some of the things that I noted, and maybe there is some room to be had, or go to failure on a repeated basis and say, wow, I have a lot more in the tank than I knew I did. And maybe there's something to be learned. That was my goal from this, is to maybe open a few people's eyes to possibilities that they hadn't thought of, because they're lost in the mix of all these bells and whistles that can be done scientifically when it maybe comes down to it is training harder with progressive overload, maybe the secret. I don't know.
I love it.
It could be. Yeah.
It always comes back to that.
There's got to be a basis in hard training, you know, and in some way, I think there has to be an improvement in performance in some way. We talked about maybe you change execution or what have you, but you know, muscles can grow just by stimulating them to resistive overload and high tensions, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't have the best genetics, you may need to be a little more particular in how you progressively overload. And I think for people who don't just grow like a weed from just going in there and banging away, that's a thing that you can control, and you can be very meticulous with it. And I mean, I tell you what, if you get to where you're a strong ass dude on all the lifts, because you did those things I mentioned in that first slide, you pushed your body weight up, you've just gone for broke, you say, and I got 3 years to make this happen, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm going to do everything I possibly can, and now I'm extraordinary in all of my lifts.
Yeah.
I'm doing heavy basic core exercises. I'm also doing the stuff that makes sure I target the muscle, and I'm training with different angles and blah, 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 all the other things that can be done. But you're just a beast, and it shows every time you train, and you don't look like it. It's like, okay, now you know, like your genetics for putting on, you've just maximized all your neurological adaptations, so to speak, and your muscles just do not want to grow. Maybe there can be something, you know, for figuring out exercises that are, as Dante would say, getting funky with it. But, you know, if you're someone who's squatting, you know, 300, 400, 500 pounds and your legs don't look like it, then, you know, that's just, you know, the luck of the draw, I think, for some people. But that will be very, very few people.
Agreed.
Even guys like Johnny Jackson, for instance, like people, his legs were always undersized, but he's so strong. Well, he's got no legs. It's like, no, he's got legs.
Yeah.
He's got massive.
You see him standing next to branch.
Yeah, you see him next to Branch or Stan Efforting too.
Yeah.
Like world's strongest bodybuilder. People say, well, he's got no. It's like, no, his legs are extraordinarily impressive. But everyone has sort of a genetic blueprint to some degree, which will determine the relative proportions of their muscle mass, the symmetry, what have you. You maximize what you've been given, and getting massively strong like that. And of course, Stan used to train differently for bodybuilding.
Yeah.
But he was still a strong ass dude.
Of course.
And he used loads when he was like training with Flex Wheeler, for instance, that were much lighter than what he would have for powerlifting. Different goals, of course. But he still had gigantic legs. So, and I think that powerlifting and training that way and getting to where he knew how to train that hard with those massive loads helped him train in the way that he did to maximize his muscle mass later on down the road. So it's the thing that's probably the least sexy for many people to just talk about, like, inching forward, microloading, that kind of thing. But it's the thing I think that is, because of that, perhaps the least exploited nowadays, or becoming less and less exploited, unfortunately. So that's what this was about, is to say, hey, if you're advanced, you're not making gains, there may still be hope. There may be some things you can still be doing that you haven't been. So take a second look.
All right, guys, we appreciate you tuning in. Of course, go to byobbcoach.com to check out Scott's book, or click the link in the description, and you can get the hardcover directly from Scott and get it signed. We are also brought to you by TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK, supplementsource.ca for Canadians. And we'll check out Patreon for the next episode, see if you guys have any topics or questions for us to cover. And Scott, for another episode of Muscle Minds, I'll see you soon. Thanks, Scott.
Out.